Hello and welcome to In Control, the first podcast on control theory. Here we discuss the science of feedback, decision making, artificial intelligence, and much more. I'm your host, Alberto Padoan, live from a recording studio in Zurich. Quick thanks to our sponsors, the National Centre of Competence in Research on Dependable Ubiquitous Automation, the International Federation of Automatic Control, and the IEEE Control Systems Society. Our guest today is Manfred Morari, Emeritus Professor in the Department of Information Technology and Electrical Engineering at ETH, and Distinguished Faculty Member in the Electrical Engineering Department at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome to the show, Manfred.
Thank you very much for the invitation, Alberto.
So, Manfred, for me, it's been a real pleasure as we talked offline to prepare this episode. And I must say that you made my job quite easy in the sense that it was easy to go through your research journey because of this farewell lecture that you've given at ETH in 2016. It's called Computation and Uncertainty, Reflections on 40 Years of Control. There will be a link in the description of the episode. And I think in one way or another, we'll be following the outline of that talk because it basically divides your academic journey into 4 chunks that you call growth, productivity, change, and continuity, to which perhaps I would add an additional one that I may call development. So what happened before your PhD? So maybe we can actually start from there. So from what I read in the records, you did your ETH Zürich diploma in chemical engineering between 1970 and 1974 under the supervision of David Ripin and Murray Rose. And I was reading from this paper by George Stephanopoulos, laying the foundations and advisor's perspective on your journey, this quote, and then maybe we can start from there. The quote says, Manfred's diligence and hard work on his diploma thesis had an unexpected negative effect on his advisor's plans for follow-up work. As Murray Rose put it in 16 April 1975 letter to Manfred, he says, quote, "We tried to get another student to work on the program, but it appears that the amount of work you had put into this has now become a legend within ETH, and all the diploma students were frightened off." What happened there?
I think I worked very hard. I used brute force methods to make those distillation calculations converge, and brute force would mean, interrupt the iterations, change the values, continue, etc. So it was not a scientifically rewarding, but it was a practical approach. And actually, I was very happy that for the farewell lecture, the one person from Ciba-Geigy attended my farewell lecture after so many years, and he co-supervised that work, my diploma work at ETH.
So as we mentioned, you started your journey in chemical engineering, not necessarily in control engineering. So the obvious question is, how did you veer off in the direction of control?
That is indeed a good question. I would say the primary driver was interest. So my interest in control started at ETH. I took a class from a visiting faculty, Dan Kugenauer, and I was interested. And so when I then went on to Minnesota, I was planning to work with 2 senior, very famous faculty, Rutherford Aries and Neil Amundsen. And I ended up, after talking to them and talking to many other faculty at the department, I ended up working for George Stephanopoulos. And I didn't even know that he was there when I applied to the University of Minnesota, but he convinced me that I should work with him. I never regretted it. This was a wonderful experience. At the start, I asked him, George, whenever I talk to the people in the department, they say control. Control is something dead. It hasn't worked in industry. Nobody's interested in it. And so, and his very short answer was, the research community is studying the wrong problems. And in a way that really defined my research, in the sense that we had a continuing discussion about what problems I should be engaged in. And that was probably the most worthwhile part of my experience as a PhD student, that I had continuously to defend what I was doing or what I was not doing, and arguing about it. And that obviously is a fantastic preparation for a future academic career if you learned to argue, if you learned to decide, to appreciate the different types of problems. So that gets me to Minnesota. And then afterwards, I was at the University of Wisconsin. It was again, basically chemical engineering department, then moved on to Caltech, again, chemical engineering. But at Caltech, I much veered out into new direction that would relate to control in general. And especially a very big influence was John Doyle there, who actually was hired first as a postdoc in the chemical engineering department. Then later on, he became a faculty in electrical engineering. And John had a great influence on me, and I didn't stick to the traditional chemical engineering lines, but moved also to other application areas like mechanical engineering, like electrical engineering. And then the big step came that when I received an offer from ETH, the offer was in electrical engineering. Okay, so that pushed me totally into another area. First, I thought I would continue some of those chemical engineering problems, but it was clear I could not attract any electrical engineering students to work on distillation columns. And that very quickly made me look for different application areas and theory that was aimed or that was suited for those other application areas. So in summary, the big step, the offer was from electrical engineering. I accepted it. I had to fit in there. And if I wanted to survive and be successful, I clearly had to change the applications.
I'm going to try to follow a somewhat chronological path. So you mentioned before that you moved from ETH to Minnesota. And in watching again this farewell lecture, you mentioned explicitly that you were debated inside whether to move there or elsewhere. And I was wondering what made you decide to lean for Minnesota in the end.
Alberto, that is a very good question, because from today's perspective, you can't even imagine how little information was available in Europe to what was going on in the United States. Okay, so the American Chemical Society published a summary of research areas for the whole US every 2 years. So that was one book for every 2 years, and every faculty was described probably by 5 lines or 6 lines. Okay, so I was lost. And the first round of applications I did is, I applied to Harvard, I applied to Princeton, schools that I knew by their reputation. Okay, it made no sense from a chemical engineering or control point of view. But then I was very lucky that there were 2 faculty in chemical engineering here at ETH who had experience from the United States and who knew the various departments and various faculty. And at the end, after various applications and so on, I had sorted through to make a choice between Caltech and University of Minnesota. So in Europe, I talked to different people and said, okay, my trouble is I don't know if I should go to Minnesota or to Caltech. And they said, Minnesota? Do you know how cold it is there? And Minnesota, why would you go there? And then one of the people who really helped me making this decision was a person, Rex Reed, who actually had gotten his PhD at the University of Minnesota. And he was losing patience with me that I couldn't decide between those 2. And finally, he said to me, do you want to learn something or do you want to impress the people in the streetcar in Zurich? Okay, and that made it for me. Just again, to give you an indication of how different things were at that time, the offer from Caltech I received via telex. Okay, you may not know what telex is, but some listeners probably do know. Let's say it was a technology that predated faxes, etc., by decades. So again, very little information, but it was one of the best decisions in my life.
Amazing. So, and I'm trying to now maybe paint the picture of how times were at that time, both in chemical engineering and in Minnesota. Again, I read this wonderful paper that I strongly advise to also the audience, Laying the Foundations, an Advisor's Perspective by George Stephanopoulos, which is basically a paper in your honor. And basically there he says that the environment at Minnesota was somewhat unique. But despite that, and there's a quote here, where he quotes one of your letters from 1975, where you say, "The past 6 months were the hardest in my life." How did that come about?
Absolutely. I mean, it came about the following way, that at ETH, we had the exams in the fall, as they also now. And by the time I finished my exams, they had long started their quarter at the University of Minnesota. There was no way I could join them. So I had to join the second term, meaning after Christmas. And the first difficulty was that 2 days after I arrived at Minnesota, they said we had the blizzard of the century. The temperature dropped by 30 degrees Fahrenheit. So that was the first challenge. And so then I joined and I signed up for various courses. And some of the courses were part 2. Part 1 I had missed. Some of them required mathematics that I should have learned in the first semester. So I was thrown into this in an environment where I was in competition or cooperation with the best chemical engineering graduate students in the US. Minnesota was at that time number 1 in chemical engineering. So when you're thrown into this, the challenge is that you actually don't know, are you just dumb, or do the other people really understand what is being discussed? So you cannot place yourself, and that puts an additional stress that you have to invest a lot of time to compete with the people who know so much. Actually, it turned out they didn't know as much at the end, but it contributed to the stress. But after that first, I would say after the first 2 quarters, so between this January and June, it was fine. Okay. So the challenge was at least partially my late arrival that I had to catch up. But even then, it was still very tough.
So from the academic perspective, I was reading that essentially, at least in the process control research area, people kept constantly talking about this infamous gap between theory and practice. Again, in this paper by George Stephanopoulos, 3 critical review papers are cited by Voss, Lee, Wickman, and Kenstenbaum. And one of those papers actually had a quote that completely struck me, and it says the following: "Control theory should not start from what skills the academician happen to have or can borrow from other disciplines, but from the major needs of the end user." This seems a quote that also applies today, but what was your experience there?
I think I was always driven by trying to solve what I would consider real problems, okay, not academic problems. And I think the time there was characterized by an enormous gap between the applications and the theory that was developed. To some extent, such a gap is necessary, because if you want information flow from one side to the other, you have to have some, let's say, knowledge gradient. Otherwise, there's no incentive. But it had reached a degree that made it hard to follow and made it hard to defend research in this area. And especially noteworthy was a workshop that I did not attend that was entitled then Chemical Process Control. It took place in 1976, and that combined the views, the practitioners' views and academic views, and it was a gold mine in terms of finding areas to work in. In the preface, it says something like, the academics take the viewpoint that industry has no clue, they don't understand the theory, that's why things are not used, while the industrial people said academia has no clue about real controller design, we don't even have to talk to them. And so there was actually a very almost aggressive atmosphere at this conference, but it was, for many people, it defined their future. The other thing I want to mention about this workshop, that workshop was number one in a sequence that took place every 5 years. Now, I think you cannot imagine there is a continuum of workshops that takes place every 5 years, but things did move at a slower pace at that time.
That should tell us something. Okay, and so basically from then on, you start your journey in research, and I guess the main topics of your PhD thesis could be summarized as looking into architectures and uncertainty for control of chemical processes. I particularly like the initial quote of your PhD thesis from Hegel, Des Lebens wahrer Inhalt ist die Tat, which for our audience means, I guess I can translate as the true essence of life lies in action. And that I would argue reflects also a lot your personality. And the PhD thesis results in a sequence of 5 papers titled Studies in the Synthesis of Control Structures for Chemical Processes, which essentially provides a rational foundation for how one should control, I would say, chemical processes, in particular distillation columns. So that is in 1980. The next move is to University of Wisconsin, which in your farewell lecture you call Growth, and that is between 1977 and 1983. I'll let you tell the story of how that unfolded.
Actually, the one interesting thing that comes first to my mind is I did many interviews for a faculty position. Something like 13 sticks to my mind. I got many offers, but I did not receive the offer which I wanted. Okay, which was an offer from Caltech. And actually, it was interesting that the person that received the offer from Caltech never showed up. And John Seinfeld, the chair of the chemical engineering, wrote me a little note, says, okay, if in the future you're ever interested, give me a call. Okay. So going back to my start at the University of Wisconsin, what was important for me there? The important was there was a culture of mentorship for young people. And I was extremely lucky to have as my mentor, informal, no committee or anything, Harmon Ray, who was a fantastic model and friend that I have to be forever grateful. And we had lunch every day together. We talked about research, we talked about students, we talked about joint proposals. It was wonderful. And he was also brutally honest in the sense that one time, I think maybe 1980 or something, I came back after the AICG meeting. That's where most people presented their research. And I talked to Harmon, and he said, you know, the one thing you talked about there was just fantastic. You know, I think this will define, that was really interesting. But the other thing, and I can go into details, it's probably not worth it, but the other area that you talked about, it was awful, okay? You sounded like a snake oil salesman, and it was just bad. It was not how we do things here, and so. So I may not have agreed with the judgment, but still it reflects that we had totally open discussions, okay? And this didn't imply that I would not get tenure or anything. It was just this friendship that I had with the people in the department. Harmon Ray is certainly on the top, and also, not in my area, Bob Bird, that all chemical engineers would recognize, was my office neighbor. He was at the home my neighbor, and also that was extremely rewarding to have him as a friend. So that's what the start. I would say Wisconsin was defined by people who really were interested in my success and in my working in relevant and important areas. And so I can only imagine how that could be possible now, but I think it would be difficult.
Based on my very limited interactions also with people at Wisconsin, it seems that some of that culture is still present, and they still continue to produce incredible talent, at least in research. So in terms of topics of research that you start looking into. I apologize in advance to those who I will not mention because we have many papers to talk about. But I guess the paper that struck me the most necessarily is Internal Model Control, a unifying review and some new results with Carlos Garcia. Here is the paper that essentially lays the foundations for some of your research for the next 10 years. And it's an incredibly fascinating story. Perhaps I should let you tell how that unfolded and how that is related also with many other research streams.
Thank you. I would love to respond to this. What triggered that research? There were two people from Shell Development coming to Wisconsin, John Haydell and David Pratt. And they came and they talked about some control work they were doing at Shell. And I may have said that at that time, but certainly I say it now, their seminar was horrible. It was horrible because you couldn't understand anything. But on the other hand, they talked about control in a way that I had never heard anybody talk about. So I said, is there something behind, or is it just talk, or can they not explain it, and so on? And after hearing them a second time, actually in 81, then I came back from the conference, the second conference in the sequence that I mentioned before, chemical process control. I came back and I talked to Carlos Garcia and I said, Carlos, stop what you're doing. This is going to be the future. We're going to work on this on this now. And Carlos did. And so what we did is I would say the foundations of predictive control without constraints, which you may argue wasn't so relevant. But still, it gave us a very useful exercise to think about that area. Carlos, by the way, is probably the first of my students who has retired, and he has been inducted into the Control Hall of Fame. He was with Shell his whole life, and he actually will be visiting here in a couple of months. And that was, I think, a lucky combination that I happened to indeed pick a good area. And the second thing is that I had a very good student who helped me on progressing in this direction. And the model predictive control, I think our benefit from this, our primary benefit apart from controller tuning, was that it led us to understand better in what way dynamics of systems, innate dynamics of systems, limit how well we can control the system. So that's another area we can engage in now or we can engage on later.
And definitely. I mean, I'm actually tempted to continue along this line and then maybe go back to also the history of model predictive control. I find it super fascinating.
Absolutely, Alberto. So one of the goals that we had at Wisconsin is we wanted to find out how system dynamics limit the performance of a control loop. So after actually a time that I spent with ICI in England in 82, we were able to define in very simple terms what are those characteristics that limit control performance. And the characteristics are, number one, it's actuator or input constraints, obvious thing. The second thing was, again, recognized non-minimum phase behavior. So system characteristics, right of plane zeros, time delays is something you cannot overcome with any control system. They're there and they limit how well you can, how good your performance gets. And the third point was less understood and less emphasized, and that is uncertainty or sensitivity or robustness, whatever term you want to use. So that, to us, actually, this was the area that Harmon Ray liked when I presented it at the AICSG meeting, this identification of the characteristics. And it turned out to be very successful in, for example, at ICI, they had some 4 different physical systems of heat exchanger networks, and we were able to identify immediately which one would be the easiest to control without ever designing a controller, because there were inherent limitations in the different systems. And the second thing, which was very successful, but came later actually at Caltech, was Sigurd Skogestad's analysis of distillation columns, where he really combined the principle of robust control and achievable performance for those distillation columns. So the dominant characteristics that identified or that indicated the quality of control that you get was the sensitivity of the closed loop system to uncertainty. And you could recognize that by just analysis different distillation columns. And the beautiful thing was that in terms of the recognition, in terms of identification of the systems, it matched exactly industrial experience, what was easy to control, what was difficult to control, which is not so typical, that you can really make this bridge between the theory and the practice and match the observations with the practical experience.
And so that is actually the motivation of what you then call internal model control. Internal model control is a structure of a controller.
I would say, the mistake we made in retrospect, obviously there had been the work with Varnam and Francis on the internal model principle, and we happened to call this internal model control, though it turned out it was our ignorance of not being aware of this being done by this obviously classical work by Francis and Varnam. So it doesn't have anything, in a very strange or indirect way, anything to do with the Varnam-Francis work. The only thing why this work, internal model control, we actually used the process model as an integral part of the control loop. Okay, so that's the internal part. The internal to the loop was the model of the process. And that then led to very simple design procedures, simple robustness analysis, etc. So it was a very good principle that helped our intuition of controllable processes on one hand, but also made the connection to MPC later on.
As you say, this predates model predictive control, MPC. For me, it was very interesting to read about the history of many paradigms, including internal model control, but also a model algorithmic control, who was developed, as I understand, in France in the late 60s. Dynamic matrix control that was basically used by Shell Oil in the late 70s, perhaps early 80s. How are these paradigms all related among each other?
I think the relationship, the model algorithmic control, is maybe a little bit more indirect, but the different versions of what Shell did, I think, is worth discussing. The first important thing to mention is that it was called dynamic matrix control, we call it now model predictive control, is very clearly a work that started in industry. That's the first very important. And one of my heroes, and the one who really contributed conceptually in a major way, was a person by the name of Charlie Cutler at Shell. And if you go to dates, if I remember correctly, actually Cutler presented this idea of model predictive control in his PhD proposal in 1969 at the University of Houston. And he then, after some time, he said, I cannot get this to industry to use, and it's not going to have an impact if I continue here in academia. I'm taking a break from my PhD studies, and I'm going to join Shell. So at Shell, he had the opportunity to actually test that on various systems, and it was successful. And he stayed at Shell quite a few years. And you may ask, how did he manage to have Shell accept this in an industrial environment where people are used to using something else? Cutler actually, once he had reached the trust of his superiors, he was in a position to say, okay, at Shell, we will use dynamic matrix control. That's it. No discussion, no more evaluation. We will use it, okay? And there was no choice. Interestingly, some years later, there was a survey in Japan, and they had a different way of deciding what control systems to use. One of the questions on that survey was, how did you decide to use algorithm X? And the answer was because the competition is using it. Okay. So that was the alternative to one of them dictating. So in this case, the competition dictated it. And I must say that the discussions I had with Cutler were always rewarding. But I want to also give you a maybe personal side about Cutler, which I always appreciated. That many years after he had developed DMC, he was a successful manager, he was the hero of this algorithm, etc. It bugged him that he did not finish his PhD. Okay. Obviously, there was no need whatsoever for him to get this PhD, but it just bothered him, okay? And so he invited me to come to Houston and have dinner with him and the chairman of the Department of Chemical Engineering at the University of Houston, Dan Loss. And I had to defend that the work by Charlie Cutler was worthy of the PhD. That was extremely important to Charlie, but he was actually nervous going into this meeting, no reason whatsoever, but he was nervous. And how did the nervousness express itself? He drove me to the restaurant. Twice he took wrong turns. Obviously it was totally familiar, but his obviously thinking was elsewhere. So it was wonderful, that I'm very sorry that later on I did not make it to Houston to meet him before he passed away. I know also in the community in general, his work was appreciated. He was, upon first being nominated, he was immediately elected to the National Academy of Engineering, which was most appropriate in my assessment, most appropriate recognition of his talents. I think I should mention one other thing here, that in this time of learning, identification, you may find valuable, and that he then became independent, he had an independent company, etc. And so there was a question of how would they get the models to do their dynamic matrix control. And he said, the first thing, when they do the experiments for doing the model, I have to be present. Okay, so he would never just take a file of data and saying, I do some identification. Because it was too often that there were some hidden, unrecorded interventions that led to behavior of the system that obviously, if you just look at the data, you don't see it. But if you're there when they do experiments, you see that actually somebody turned off something for 15 minutes and then came on again. So he believed very strongly that he had to be there in the modeling phase.
He was part of the system identification algorithm.
Absolutely.
And this is also a significant example of something that, well, at the time, I believe there was no theory supporting the use of these algorithms, but they were successful in practice, and then they stimulated research later on.
Yeah. There are various reasons for this. One is that, those processes that they were controlling, most of them are relatively simple, okay? They're not like some mechanical system with 2 or 3 resonant frequency. They're very sensitive to control action taken, etc. They are all kind of sluggish processes, so they're forgiving. So that helped a lot to work.
I guess this is actually a good stage to maybe start talking about the next chapter of your academic journey and your research journey. In my notes, I see a very significant moment that you call a turning point also in your farewell lecture, and that's the IFAC workshop on robust control in 1982. This is a workshop that has been organized in Interlaken, Switzerland by Jürgen Ackermann. And this is where you meet many influential figures at the time, but apparently it was also a very restricted circle of people that were working on robust control.
Restricted circle? No. It was not a restricted circle. It was a small circle where the whole effort started. There weren't more people interested. Okay, it was not like there were people not allowed to participate. That was just a small group, not advertised. And I remember I heard about it when I visited Gunther Stein at Honeywell in Minneapolis. And there he mentioned this, and then I signed up, and that was fine. It is important, as you mentioned, just to emphasize that again, it was co-organized by Mohamed Mansour and Jörg Dörfler here at ETH. And they clearly had recognized that to be an important area, this robustness. And to me, what happened is that we had already had some ideas in this direction. And then I was lucky to meet John Doyle there. And then we saw that actually many principles that we were working on were parallel. So we immediately had a very good connection. And at that time, both Doyle mentioned that he was thinking about coming to Caltech, and I said I was thinking about coming to Caltech. And so we essentially decided more or less at the same time that we would come to Caltech, or that I would come to Caltech and I hired John. Okay. But the workshop was very influential. When you look at the people, some of them names I remember, Bob Barmish and Paul Frank, who then died very quickly, unfortunately, very soon. Then Hubert Quackenach, Doug Luce, Allbrod, Gunther Stein, Jörg Dörfler, they all played major roles later on in that area. So it was this step of communication that was very important in this development.
So after that workshop, 1983 is the next chapter of your academic journey that you call productivity finally at Caltech. So finally the dream comes true. And here I would say you mentor an impressive amount of very well-known academics that today are actually professors in many important universities. And as you say, you start your journey in this area of robust control. How did that unfold?
We already worked on the robust control coming from Wisconsin. And the connection and the inspiration through John was extremely important because it gave us some of the mathematical tools that we were not familiar with, and it allowed us to apply those tools to practical problems. So that was very important. And as you know, John then stayed at Caltech thanks to our interventions, I would say, with the provost, because there were some kind of interesting arguments in the sense, so what's John Doyle doing now? Oh, he's visiting. Where is he visiting from? We really don't know where. So he had this special position. And then I was very honest with the provost and said, there's some risk, okay? There's risk. Well, I told him about the whole story. I came there and so on. And the provost, Rabbi Vogt, said, this is Caltech, we have to take risks. And that to me was a very beautiful statement that really reflected the whole institute and the whole university on how they would operate. The other good thing about getting on John is we wanted this connection to the practice. And you may not realize that from what you know about John, but there was a very intensive, very close collaboration with Honeywell. And I think the whole area would not have prospered so well if it hadn't been because of those industrial collaborations, the Honeywell being just one of them.
So here, in terms of works that I'd like to dig into, certainly there's one that appears, we mentioned it before already, we hinted at it before, in 1986, with Daniel Rivera and Sigurd Skogestad, called Internal Model Control PID Controller Design. This is a hugely influential paper that deals with essentially showing, well, I'll actually let quote from the paper itself. Our intention is to present a clear and more logical framework for PID controller design, which is simple to understand and implement while possessing sound fundamental basis. That was the intention of that paper.
I think this was a little bit overselling it, I think, when I hear you quoting from the paper now. The fact however, is that with some subsequent modification by Sigurd Skogestad that are also written up in his textbook, the algorithm was extremely successful. It was successful in the sense that it is now in, I think, most process control systems, commercial systems, it is a standard default choice for doing controller tuning. And for many reasons, I think it has some, contrary to the standard PID parameters, it had some parameters that have direct effect on the performance, which is not true necessarily with a standard PID parameter and rules that have been proposed by other people. So that contributed a lot. I think it was not a goal by itself to do this work. It was a very successful side product. Okay, it was not something that you would say, okay, this is one step, then follow 3 or 4 more steps in this area. Yes, there were improvements, but they didn't provide any fundamental deviations anymore. So it was we recognized, I think, this potential. So why did we recognize it? We gave short courses to industry, many per year, 1, 2, 3, Case Western Reserve, at other places in Pasadena, etc. And at one point, one of the industrial participants said, how is this related to PID parameters? And so then it bothered us that we could not immediately say, that's the relationship with the standard PID parameters. And then actually, during the course, we came up with some first attempt of making the connection with this IMC and the PID tuning rules. And then obviously afterwards, it was all refined that it fit into that framework. But that's again what I want to emphasize is very often there came challenges from the outside, came ideas from the outside that we may have never thought about. But we did, obviously, there were all those people from industry sitting, they were all interested in this, so there was a potential, and it worked out very well.
So one question I have, obviously, just in the interest of clarity also for our audience, when we say PID, we mean proportional integral derivative controllers, the most basic controller we can think of. I was curious to know whether by then the standard was still Ziegler and Nichols rules for tuning, or were there other improvements?
Not necessarily. There's a ton of improvements that I couldn't even cite now. I probably never looked at in detail. Everybody had kind of his favorite algorithm for certain applications and so on. But I believe from all I know now that this combination of those original ideas plus the improvements that were done by Sigurd Skogestad's group are pretty much the standard now. There are others, but this is probably the most popular.
So much of this research coalesces into a book that you write also with Evangelos Zafiriou, A Robust Process Control, printed by Prentice Hall. That's essentially, as I understand, the full stop on the subject of chemical process control.
I don't think that's true. I think that this is you're praising it too much. It was something that we enjoyed greatly working on it. The sad part of it was that the one participant that is not in the list of authors because his wife didn't want it is Kostas Economou. He was a student at Caltech, and he had already received an offer in the chemical engineering department at Minnesota. And then he died rather suddenly of leukemia. And so he would have been a fantastic colleague and a fantastic academic. So it was a very sad story that affected us very much. And that was also a driver for putting this book together. And I think we learned a lot. Obviously, as always with books like this, as soon as you finish, you say, okay, if I wrote it now, I would do things differently, but then it would never have gotten finished. And I think it was, we put a lot of understanding into it, and therefore I think it was adopted, not for teaching it, I think, or not much for teaching, but it then gave rise to books like the one by Sigurd Skogestad, which I would say is a follow-up, which really was more lasting because it was written at a later time when those tools that he used weren't available when we wrote it. But for us, it was a very satisfying adventure.
So as we mentioned before, this phase is called productivity. We mentioned before the interaction with John Doyle. And so as an outcome of this interaction, together with Sigurd Skogestad in 1988, you published the paper called Robust Control of Ill-Conditioned Plant, High Purity Distillation. This paper receives the IEEE CSS George Axelby Outstanding Paper Award, one of the highest recognitions in our field, where essentially, as you say, you use some of the tools that also John contributed to creating to show in practice what kind of behaviors are actually difficult to control. And you use the high purity distillation columns as an example. Maybe I should let you tell more about this.
Yes, I think, Alberto, that's a very good introduction. I think when I look back at it now, why is it important? It's important because the interest in robust control has clearly decreased in the time since that paper was published. And so you want to question, is that okay that the interest has decreased, or are we missing something? Now, what the paper demonstrates is robust control is not equal to H-infinity control. Actually, the principle in this paper can be explained without any H-infinity control theory or controller design, but it does provide a certain insight into what system dynamics make a system difficult to control. In this case, it was ill conditioning of the system. And I think this is some general knowledge that the control engineer should have independent of the mathematical details. And I faced often consulting jobs in industry where we had problems from practice, some oscillation, airplane, and we were challenged with saying, okay, why is it happening? What's the reason behind this poor behavior of the system? And to answer those questions, the tools that we have used essentially in this paper that you cite help tremendously. And so in this sense, I think control, robust control, should be an integral part of what the students learn. Should it be, with all the mathematical theory? Not necessarily, okay? But they need to develop some intuitive and qualitative sense of what kind of behavior can result from model errors. And why do you want to avoid building a system that leads to sensitivities to model errors in the control system design? And this should be really an integral part of the control education.
I guess some of the tools that we haven't mentioned, but they figured in this paper are mu calculation, mu synthesis. The audience can also refer to some of the episodes that we recorded earlier with John Doyle. We discussed them at length. And after this period, then there's an explosion of papers where there's all sorts of very interesting ideas, at least from my perspective. I can cite at least two that I'd like to discuss with you. And then obviously, if you have more, I'm very happy to cover more. One of them was interesting for me, the computational complexity of mu calculation with Richard Bratz and Peter Young, together also with John Doyle, where you show in a very short and concise paper that the computation of mu is essentially an NP hard. And therefore, and I quote here from your paper, the main results strongly suggest that it's futile to pursue exact methods for calculating mu of general systems with pure or real or mixed uncertainty for other than small problems. However, these results do not mean that practical algorithms are not possible. Very interesting contribution. There will be a link in the description, of course. And the other one is robust constrained model predictive control using LMIs. This is a paper that received later on the IFAC High Impact Paper Award, one of the highest recognitions, if you wish, in our field. I'll let you tell the story of how this came about.
Happy to do so, Alberto. First of all, the paper with Richard Bratz and Peter Young, all the credit goes to those two authors. And how did it come about? It came about that Richard Bratz took a course where one of the topics was to look into more detail into this complexity theory. And he very quickly saw the connection to the problem that is underlying the mu computation. And I would say he wrote it pretty much alone. But the outcome of this, Peter Young's work, was important in the sense that he actually wrote many of the algorithm from that time that allowed that mu computation for relatively large systems. So that was the practical outcome on how he designed the algorithms. So I think the suspicion that it was NP-hard was always there. But it was very nice to see that rigorous and see it proven. Did it affect the work in the future? Yes, I think in general it has this excuse of a hurdle in our path. But obviously you cannot build on this alone. The real building was done by Peter Young in terms of developing those algorithms. That's the one. The other paper with Raghu Balakrishnan and Mayuresh Kothari, that has an interesting history. Many of the listeners will know Raghu is now dean at Case Western Reserve University. Before that, he was at Purdue University. And he was actually Stephen Boyd's first PhD student. So he came for a postdoc to Caltech. And obviously, he brought with him all that LMI knowledge. And there were eager students to pick it up at Caltech, one of them, Mayuresh Kothari. And so they conceived that main idea on how those LMIs could be used to describe uncertainty and to actually do the robust control using the LMIs. They came to my office with the idea, and I must admit, and they still remember, that I was less than enthusiastic about the idea because I thought it was computationally not tractable, it was conservative, etc. So I did not encourage them, but I did not hinder them. So I said, okay, if you want to do that, you want to look at it, fine, but I don't think it has much promise. So this is an example. I just have to mention this as a counterpoint of what I mentioned before, what I did with Carlos Garcia, where I was convinced that this would be, with good chance, a very important step that we were taking, while this one, I was not convinced. But I was lucky. And they pulled through it, and I think it's great that it received so much attention. It certainly was for a long time the only paper that took this approach.
As far as I understand, basically you incorporate uncertainty in the model plant in model predictive control.
Yes.
Posing the problem of essentially a worst case objective to minimize a min-max problem, and then you upper bound it somehow and use linear matrix inequalities as mentioned to capture constraints.
Exactly. I should have emphasized it is a model predictive control. It's a robust model predictive control scheme, and the computation for this worst case, as you just summarized, were done through those LMIs. And I think at that time, the LMIs were rarely used. People didn't know what you could do with them and to what extent they were useful. And I think the timing there was also important when we published this.
Okay, so we are now about to get to the point of change. So we just talked about robust constrained model predictive control using linear matrix inequalities. That's published in 1994. Obviously, there will be linked in the description. 1994 is also a time when you move back to Switzerland, to ETH Zürich. I've seen, again, in your farewell lecture that was not an easy decision. Why was that the case?
You know, at that time, we had lived in the US for 20 years. So I came there in 75, so that was 20 years. And after 20 years, you adjust in ways, and anywhere else you go, it's a challenge. I think that was one factor. The second factor is I felt at that point in my life, either I go back to Europe now, meaning in 94, or I will never go back. So that was the other challenge. And the third challenge was that it was electrical engineering department. Okay, so in one sense, you can say, and I took it such, that this is an interesting challenge. It will force me to do different things. It will force me to do new things because I have to be in a new environment, as I mentioned before, and I have to adjust. Now, one challenge was, at least implicit, the department. And that means, in particular, the chairman of the department at that time was Leuthold, and he was a full classical electrical engineer. And so when I came to him for my visit, I'm not quite sure if I had already accepted the offer from ETH or not, but when I came to talk to him, he was very friendly. He welcomed me and so on. And he said, it's really nice that you are joining or want to join. We have diversity in the department. We have electrical engineers, we have physicists, and now we have a chemist. And so I had to explain a bit, I'm not quite a chemist. And then he said, okay, whatever, I hope that you know at least Ohm's law. And it took me aback because I was not sure if he was serious or not. Later on, when I had a very good relationship with Peter Leuthold, I reminded him of this comment that he made, and he said he did not remember anymore. I was not convinced that it had the truth. In any case, it turned out well. So another challenge coming here is I was used to Caltech quality students, okay? And this is off scale in graduate students and even more so undergraduate students. And then I came to ETH, and overall, the quality, let's say, the average quality of students was not anywhere as good. But it's not really fair to do this comparison because the mission of Caltech and the mission of ETH, those are different. You know, ETH is an institution that has to serve a country, and it has to therefore have a different objective, a different approach than an institution which is built up only to carry out first-rate, world-class research. But still, I certainly wanted to continue the quality of work that I had been doing at Caltech. And so the first thing I tried to do is say, okay, I know what I want to do. For example, I want graduate courses, okay? So that every graduate student in the department should pass a certain number of fundamental courses in order to be fully accepted in the PhD program. This idea, I had some support in the department. It didn't fly for whatever reasons, maybe correctly so or so. And there were other attempts that I made on changing ETH, at least in my institute or also in the department and further, that would have brought ETH to the Caltech ideal in my mind. And I would say essentially all of them failed, my attempts. And it was not realistic. And I was woken up by the comments of one of my very, very good friends, unfortunately passed away, Ruel Chinard at the City University, New York. And I talked to him my experiences here. He visited here often. And so at the beginning, when I described to him my frustrations of making changes, he said, Manfred, and he had this heavy, I would say, Austrian Hebrew accent. And he said, Manfred, don't try to change the place unless you're the president. And I think there's a lot of truth in this statement. And I afterwards, not only because of this statement, but just in general, I said, you know, if I cannot change it, then maybe I should figure out how I can use the system here and I can make the best out of it. And so I went on an range of trips throughout Europe with the goal of recruiting graduate students. And I focused actually very much to Southern Europe because I felt Northern Europe, students from Germany, they would want to stay in Germany and so on. While in Southern Europe, let's say, obviously Italy, for example, but also the Balkan area, and so Croatia and Serbia and Czech and also Slovakia, they were wonderful sources of students. Why? Because they had superb education, but they had not many opportunities in their countries to continue graduate studies, etc. And so that's what I could offer. And I think within very short time, I had attracted many good students from those geographic areas. And then it was wonderful and great fun with those students to build up or to continue the build-up of the institute. But it was initially, when you asked about the challenges, initially it was a challenge, and it was not clear that I could actually be successful in it. Also, John Seilfeld, I remember at Caltech, where I was about to leave, he said, after I told him how much research money I would receive, he would just respond, the money doesn't get you anywhere unless you have the people. And this clearly is very true, especially if we do theoretical work or, let's say, low-cost research where all the money goes into salaries and not into sophisticated equipment. So it was many challenges, but in retrospect, and I'm sure Alberto said that in my farewell lecture, I was extremely happy of having made that step. And now, obviously, things have changed, and the difference between US and Switzerland and communication. So now it's a different environment. But at that time, and looking back and how things developed after this step, I feel it was an excellent step, and I'm grateful to ETH to having helped me make this step.
I think it's great to hear also from you directly that some of the moments were actually challenging, and at the time it wasn't clear whether success was an option. You also mentioned some of the interventions that you tried to implement at ETH. One thing I didn't mention before is that you first, at some point, you served as the head of the Institute for Automation and also of the department at a later stage. At Caltech, something that I didn't mention before, you contributed to establishing I don't know whether I should call it a center, but the Control and Dynamical Systems Center or Institute. And obviously, as you mentioned, you advised and mentored a number of important figures in our field. I'm naming a few: Alberto Bemporad, Francesco Borrelli, Colin Jones, Melanie Zeilinger, Gianni Ferrari Trecate, among many others. I guess I can start from the first, because it doesn't just seem to have had impact, the research you've done together, but it also was awarded again another IFAC High Impact Paper Award, 2014. What I'm talking about now is control of systems integrating logic, dynamics, and constraints. I found that paper incredibly interesting to read myself. Again, there will be a link in the description. That's a paper where you introduce what you call mixed logical dynamical systems. These are systems that combine linear dynamics, logic rules, and constraints. And basically, as far as I understand, the idea is to deploy model predictive control using also mixed integer quadratic programming online control, essentially. But I'll let you tell the story of how that unfolded.
Thanks, Alberto. I think it unfolded in the following way, that the ideas came from my friendship with Ignacio Grossman, who is at the chemical engineering department at Carnegie Mellon University, who had worked on mixed integer programming his whole life. Okay, so he's a little bit older than I am, but even at those early days in his PhD research with Roger Sargent, he did use mixed integer model descriptions to solve some process optimization, process design problems. And I was familiar with this work, and so because it's basically, as you said, Alberto, it's a way of solving those mixed integer problems and software. So the next step was, how can we use that in our environment for the problems that we are interested in? And it didn't take much thinking to see, okay, we can certainly formulate interesting control tasks, that would require this mixed integer, or that it could benefit from this mixed integer description. And that was essentially the state of my thinking here at ETH, and I made attempts to convince some graduate students that this would be a good thing to work on. And so the one met Tyler, an extremely gifted student. He also wrote a paper on it. He thought it was stupid. So he didn't think it was anything interesting. Then I tried to convince another student to work in this, and she never got going on it. My pushing wasn't successful. And then somehow, I'm not sure what led to it, but I linked up with Alberto, and I visited him in Italy, and I described to him the goal and what we should be doing, just in not more detail than what I'm describing now. And Alberto was immediately excited to work on this. And I think the important part of what made the paper well-known, accepted, why it was of interest, is that Alberto understood to put a nice general framework around it, like this MLD systems. Are they the best descriptions? Probably not. 20 years have passed. Better things have come, fortunately. But this framework that he created was, I think, an important contributor to the acceptance and by the community and to the interest by the community. But you have to also realize that at that time, mixed integer programming in general was not widely used. And so in particular, what we wanted to do in similarity to typical control formulations, we wanted to have a formulation that would end up in a mixed integer quadratic program with a quadratic objective, because that's most suitable for our control tasks. But at that time, there were only mixed integer linear programming codes. The only code that was available, we found at that time, was by Fletcher and Leifer at Stanford. And so we were working using basically experimental research code that we were using for solving those problems. Now, obviously, MIQPs in every solver, MILP, MIQP, that's just a different option. But at that time, it was unusual. It was not standard at all. So it was not obvious the route that we took. But we found enough examples where it was very convincing how you could actually, again, using online this mixed integer quadratic programming, how you could actually design controllers, predictive controllers, that would give you stability guarantees. And even for a reasonably sized problem, which was totally impossible using other tools. So I think that combination made it interesting and successful. And I believe that we were the first group to use mixed integer formulations for analyzing and synthesizing controller for hybrid systems.
As you say, and those are also the years where the topic, if we want, of hybrid system picks up. And there's plenty of research, not only at ETH, but also in the US on the subject. You yourself also, together with others, not only Alberto Bemporad, but for example, Gianni Ferrari Trecate, work on piecewise affine systems, for example. And I guess another important publication around this time is the so-called explicit linear quadratic regulators for constrained systems. Another very creative idea, I would call it. The idea is basically to, defer the computation to offline whenever possible, essentially, to speed up the practical deployment of model predictive controllers. How did that come about?
Alberto, I first want to add something to that last description in the direction of hybrid systems.
Yes.
Actually, when Alberto Bemporad and I, when we started working on this area, we did not know anything about hybrid systems. We were not familiar with the terminology. And then by chance, we found out that actually Berkeley had some funded research emphasis in hybrid systems. And so I remember that I talked to some of the organizers and I invited myself. I convinced them that we could also contribute in a different way to the hybrid systems area. So the research, I think the lucky thing was it was exactly at the right time. It was exactly at the right time because other people obviously had identified hybrid systems as an important area for systems research, and our research came into it from a different direction. Okay, nobody there did any mixed integer programming work. So it was lucky that we did it, and when we did it, that was lucky. So it was not difficult at all to convince the people of its importance. So now you have to repeat your question.
No problem. I can think of many names actually that now that you mentioned that we're working at the time.
Exactly.
Shankar Sastry,
exactly.
Possibly the first that comes to mind, but many others. Arjen van der Skaaf.
Yes, exactly. So that was a lucky thing. But you asked another question.
No. I was here. I'm really butchering so much of the stuff that you've done around those years. There were many publications that were quite interesting, and here I'm just selecting very few. One of them was the explicit linear quadratic regulator for constrained systems. I thought that was quite relevant, very interesting idea, and I just wanted to understand how did it come about.
Very good question. It came actually about because of the hybrid systems work, which the ideas that I just described came before that. And clearly, especially at that time, we were hit by the online computation requirements. So it was not like the typical MPC formulation, linear systems, quadratic objective function, where the computational challenges were there, but only for very, very large systems. Otherwise, it was easy. Now we face this possible challenge of solving mixed integer quadratic programs online, and that seemed prohibitive. And so then we said, okay, maybe we can do approximate solution. Obviously, we did try to do some approximation, but the approximations did not work well because those systems are switched. So how to do proper approximations was extremely difficult. How to identify piecewise linear systems and how to do optimization and so on. So that was almost prohibitive. And then said, okay, why don't we just check in general how we could reduce the computational effort, not even talking immediately about hybrid systems, but just talking about our standard linear systems with quadratic objective. And then I remembered that I had some notes by Evangelos Tsaferiou that you mentioned before as the co-author of our book. And in those notes, he identified the basic structure of the solution of a linear quadratic regulator problem, but actually with constraints, so the MPC problem. So I remember that he had done something, and indeed he had first recognized, he was long gone in either Maryland, where he was first a professor and then industrial career. But we went back to this, and clearly he had the main structure on how the solution would look like. And then the next thing was that we did not have a solver for those, how they are called in general, parametric programs. So optimization problems that are dependent on one or several parameters. Obviously, in our case, those parameters were the states. So you had an optimization problem that changed. What changed on it is not weighting matrices and so on, but just the parameters that represented the states. We did not know anything about parametric programs. Even the name we found out afterwards that this is what it was called. And it actually, in some optimization areas, it was established, there are books on it and so on, but we did not know that. But I happened to go for a seminar, be invited for a seminar at Imperial College. So I went to Imperial College and I talked to Stratos Pistikopoulos, who had actually developed some basic parts of a method to solve parametric programs. No connection to control whatsoever. But in our discussion, I immediately recognized that those methods that they had developed would be totally suitable for solving the control problems. So that was the pointer that we got, though we then used later different approaches from different people, etc. But we had made this connection to him to parametric programs. And so we went back. I think I called Alberto even from the hotel and said, we have the method to solve those problems we want to solve to reduce the online computational effort. And so we started from this and we continued and we built up basically what you mentioned. We built up the method of finding the explicit solutions of those parametric programs so that the online evaluation changed from an optimization problem to a simple lookup table. Now, ultimately, I think one has to be honest and reflect on what we have done 25 years ago and say, okay, was this the right approach? Was it the wrong approach? Was it successful? Not? In terms of the computational effort, the question is always the competition here within those MPC problems, the competition between online optimization and actually offline optimization, develop the solution and which one, and then just doing online the lookup table, how do they compare? No? And clearly, when I gave also a seminar at Stanford on this topic, it was clear that Stephen Boyd didn't totally believe that this would be the long-term method of choice to do this explicit solution, because whatever computational tools you have, it becomes very unwieldy. Okay, so very quickly you get thousands, tens of thousands of regions. So actually the lookup table for those regions was already unwieldy and you would have a hard time finding the proper element in your lookup table. So I would say at this point, one can say safely, was this the method? Has this evolved into the method of choice? No. On the other hand, it brought very good insight. Insight in the sense that we understood the solution structure of the problem. We understood what made it complicated, when it would be complicated. And this was very important insight. So what's left from there, I think, from today's perspective, is the insight we got into the structure of the solution and also the property of the solution, the continuity of the gradients in certain parts. For example, those were very important discoveries that also helped us then later on in the solution using optimization methods. But that by itself wouldn't be used, okay? But that doesn't mean it was not useful in terms of the learning, in terms of the understanding of the algorithm, in terms of understanding the control law. Just, how does a control law for some high-dimensional system, optimal control law for a system linear with constraints, how does this look like? Okay, is the control law, is it continuous? Those were all questions that were not clear at the time that we approached the problem. And so in this sense of providing insight, I think it was an important paper.
It was definitely important. I'll just try to take a step back for our audience to because we mentioned many names. I just realized now, first of all, we didn't actually outline how model predictive control works. So we should have done it before. Model predictive control, I'll try my best, but basically we are using a model to predict the future. Based on this prediction, we decide on a control action, we apply this control action, we measure again the output of our system and repeat in a recursive fashion. Also, just now we mentioned what is a multi-parametric program. This is essentially, at least for quadratic programs with subject to linear constraints, you can envision, again, posing this kind of problem and thinking that the x variable of your program being a parameter that we vary. And as you say, you've used these tools to essentially show that the solution of the linear quadratic regulator subject to constraint has certain properties, one of which, as you say, is continuity. The other one, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's that the solution is piecewise linear. So it has a very peculiar structure. And this induces, as you mentioned before, I thought about this because you mentioned regions, and I want to clarify for our audience what those regions are. These are regions where the structure, the solution is linear. And so what one can do is, first of all, identify those regions, partition the state space into those regions, and then basically evaluate this function through a lookup table. Now, as you mentioned, as we grow the dimension of the state space, the number of those regions explodes, and therefore one has problems for large state spaces. I hope I did justice to what you just said.
You did a great job. Just to emphasize, the problems come, maybe obviously, in two ways. One is just computing the solution, because you can say, okay, it doesn't matter, I do it offline, I just let it run overnight and I get this. It's, yes, in principle, but the numerics become very ugly, okay? So that's where as you can imagine, you have all those regions, but the holes evolve in there just because of numerical accuracy. And the second, which we obviously underestimated, is that online you have this lookup table, but actually finding the region as you described it, where you stayed in out of millions of regions, to identify that region and therefore to be able to recover the controller gain at that point was a major effort. So just having an explicit solution in terms of a lookup table doesn't necessarily make it easy. But yes, you described that very well. I would even simplify the MPC concept further from what you said. I would say what we are doing is we're having an initial state. We are doing a trajectory optimization. Okay? So we compute, as you described, the sequence of control inputs and outputs. But then what we implement is only the first one of those computed inputs. And then we do the implementation, and then we go back to a new state measurement. And obviously this moving horizon concept, where we move also our initial point as time, initial starting point, that leads to that is a feedback structure that we are utilizing, and that's where the control action, the feedback control action comes from this moving horizon shifting the initial state.
And that's an implicit way of defining a controller, and hence also the name of explicit that we just mentioned.
Exactly. The controller itself is an optimization algorithm. It's not just an evaluation of some function, it's an optimization algorithm is the controller. That's why the name.
I think from here, so we are situated in time around 2002. I think at this stage, it's interesting to mention at least a couple of things. So one is, as you mentioned, how does one mitigate now this problem of large state spaces? You already hinted at that, perhaps using online optimization as a way to go essentially beyond the curse of dimensionality. And also another, I think, important aspect is that you produced in the process a number of toolboxes, a number of also spin-off companies that came out of your endeavors, looking at MPC and also then embedded MPC. I don't know whether there's any of these two topics that you would like to cover.
I mean, certainly the spin-off that I think at this point that came out of our group and was the most successful at this time was Embotech, that was founded by Alex Tomahidi. And I think at the moment he has about 80 employees that all do, I wouldn't call it necessarily MPC, but doing trajectory optimization in different environments and develop tools, mostly for the automotive industry. I think there were other, certainly, efforts of starting companies, but not all of them equally successful. I think now that is more common to have as a goal this company culture, company founding, spin-off company culture. It is interesting to reflect that at the time that I was at Caltech, this was clearly something that was frowned upon. So there were only very few people, I can think of two at the moment, the one in chemistry, Bill Goddard, and then Chuck in electrical engineering. There may have been others, but special electrical engineering effort was not appreciated by a lot of the Caltech faculty. That was not viewed as their objective of a faculty at Caltech. Clearly, that has totally changed. So when you look at Caltech and here at ETH, I don't know the history. Obviously, there was always some history of startups, but now there are clearly many very successful ones, and I'm proud of Alex's effort of having come out of our group.
One of the directions that you see that you take at that stage, for example, with Colin Jones, Menelin Zeilinger, and others, of course, is to look into faster implementations of model predictive control. There is a wonderful cartoon also in your farewell lecture, I guess prepared by Colin Jones, it might be, where you list a number of applications at different timescales of, again, model predictive control. Is there any that you remember more dearly than others?
First of all, the cartoon is indeed by Colin Jones that you recognized correctly. I think it depends on the time axis, what were reflecting on it. I think there were many that were interesting. But there's some general remarks. The general remark is the following. There was an effort involving a number of people, including Alex, including Stefan Richter, including a number of others, Paul Goulart, etc., that wanted to have a speed goal for the online computation, at least for the case of linear systems with constraints. I'm not talking about hybrid systems now. Their goal was megahertz sampling rates. And they achieved it, at least in terms of simulation, looking at the numerics, etc. So indeed, with the appropriate hardware, FPGA hardware, we can design controllers, or we can have running control systems that are at megahertz rates, and for systems of arbitrary size. Arbitrary size in the sense that we have to scale the hardware up appropriately to deal with the bigger size. So when the students, the collaborators did this work, we obviously wanted to illustrate the success of this method on a real system. And it turns out that we had a hard time finding any physical system that required a controller to act at megahertz sampling rates. So that means to look, for example, for somebody now to say, okay, how can we speed up MPC? There's no incentive for it. We can run MPC, again, linear system with constraints, we can run MPC at any rates that we need. So there's no incentive for making it faster because there are no applications. And that was also an important, I think, discovery in a way.
I guess a related publication that we can quote here is Embedded Online Optimization for Model Predictive Control at Megahertz Rates, 2014, together with Jerez, Goulart, Richter, Konstantinides, and Kerrigan.
It needed really the input of experts also outside ETH, as you mentioned, Konstantinides. That was very essential to cover the area such that we had sufficient knowledge to come out to a successful conclusions of this target.
So I hope I'm not missing any important work, but we're gradually shifting towards the actual farewell lecture that we actually started from. So that's 20th of May, 2016. You give, again, this wonderful farewell lecture at ETH, strongly recommended to the audience also. I think what struck me the most was perhaps the lessons learned along the way. You list 5 lessons. Maybe I should let you tell them, because that's actually your personal synthesis, if you wish, of your own journey.
Yes, the lessons are very, very important, but I recognized the lessons obviously afterwards. They weren't consciously chosen path points, but when I reflected later on it, those were important ingredients that made things that were successful. The first one that I'm seeing here is listen to the right people. And I think maybe that's very important to emphasize to graduate students. It's unlikely that you do great research if you're just closing yourself in a closet and trying to come up with some grandiose control or analysis schemes. It is extremely important that you talk to a lot of people. Why? Because you want to define the right problem to study in your research. And right means many things. Right means it's important, but right also means that actually just important is not enough. You have to have some idea on how to solve it. Otherwise, we have tons of important problems, but identifying those without an approach is not helpful. And you have to do it at the right time. And the right time means, for example, when we did the MPC work early on, that was exactly when everybody was interested in, as I mentioned before, the hybrid systems area. By chance, we had exactly the right time because there was a community independent from us that was interested in it. We did not have to convince people of the importance of the work that already had been established and that other people were working already on it. And it was lucky in a way. The other thing, at least for us, was we always wanted to solve real problems. And so one thing I didn't mention to you, Alberto, and maybe it's not even explicit in the list of papers that you were taking your points from, is that what was the first real application of our hybrid system controller? And the first application we actually had with Ford Motor Company. And it happened that they were interested in some traction control system, and the physics there suggest a piecewise affine description or formulation of the model that describes the tire friction. And so that lent itself to be a very interesting example problem, and we connected with Ford, and Davor Hrovat was very instrumental on helping us with the organization and the connections at the Ford. So we implemented that on a vehicle that was then test-driven in northern Michigan, where I think all the car companies test their winter equipment, and it worked. And it worked means this hybrid controller worked on very good performance of the traction controller. Now, obviously, traction control, we didn't invent it. Ford had studied this for a long time. So the question comes clearly, okay, is it any good what we did? Are we competitive with what they had done? And the conclusion was, for me, interesting but not surprising. They said, okay, our performance with the hybrid system control system was fine. Okay, it was fine in the sense that it was competitive with what they had achieved by whatever tools and simulation approach they had chosen. But the difference was we did it in 2 weeks from making the model to doing the test drive, while it had taken them many months to get to this point. And so that's also, I think, to position research in its proper place. It doesn't mean necessarily that you have to beat the control system that's there, but clearly ours was much simpler to maintain. It was a very simple model. It was a simple description of the problem. And on top of this, just doing the optimization was very effective. So we didn't improve, but we improved, let's say, the engineering effort that was necessary on reaching this performance. And we always tried to do this connection to the engineering practice. The one that I was also very interested in is the work we did together with ABB. I had to build a control system for a big drive that they used for the pumping station for gas transported from Norway to the UK. I think it's, again, something we were able to do at ETH, which I'm not sure you would be able to do at other places. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about that the computational resources that were available for running those controllers for the drive were limited. And you had to, I think part of it had to be programmed in the assembler language. So it was a real challenge. But we had the freedom of hiring a student who spent 1 year with ABB of actually implementing the control system, and it was a great success with real full-scale implementation. So this was clearly a very satisfying problem that we were able to solve, and it took a lot of history of relationship and trust building with ABB before we were able to do that. And so many of our graduates from our institute, undergraduates, graduates, went to work with ABB, and they all participated in one way or the other in this project. And without that, we wouldn't have been able to do that. So it was a really long-term effort, and having also parts of it that you can't call research. So, for example, implementation of that controller in assembly, that's not research. It was an enormous task, and we had to do it. ABB would not, they would be happy to finance a student, but they would not be willing to do it. And so I think with the ETH environment, where it is possible to do that combined with industry, it's the recipe for long-term successful implementation of the research results. The last point I had on those lessons learned, I think, is also very important. I mentioned before the criticism of Hammond Ray regarding snake oil salesmen. But the one lesson is, you really have to communicate, and you have to communicate in an understandable way. And it pays off to perfect a presentation at a conference. I would say, contrary to maybe other efforts, but preparing a talk, I found sometimes very small changes make an enormous difference on the effect. It is not incremental success, after you have 90%, you're almost there. No, it's just some transitions that can be very important. And maybe I should repeat what I said in my lecture regarding the communication, a quote from Charles Darwin where it says, "In science, credit is given to those people who convince others of an idea, not to the people who first had the idea." So that gives you the indication on the importance of communication.
So, as we mentioned, this is 2016. Unfortunately, ETH has a very strict rule for retirement. I think they want people to retire at the age of 65, if I'm correct. So somehow, though, the University of Pennsylvania manages to convince you to join them as a distinguished faculty fellow. And that's the continuity chapter of your academic journey. How did you choose to relocate to Pennsylvania?
That's, again, a good question. Okay, so what attracted me? First of all, I did make some initiative to find some appointment in the US, and I had several offers. And so what convinced me Penn was the following. I went there on a visit, and I talked to especially George Papas, but other faculty, graduates, etc. And I found that there were many points where I could connect to the research that they were doing. So on one hand, there were those many points. On the other hand, they did very different things. But in terms of my contributions, it was very clear that I would have many connections that I could benefit from and have interesting collaborations. The second thing is I have to, in this taped recording, I have to pay compliments to George Papas, who I think was, for me, certainly a big reason for coming to Penn, because of his combination of new ideas, new approaches, not incremental type of effort speeding up things or something like that, or making things fast, but really conceptual new ideas and fundamentals that were extremely exciting. The third one was that I found immediately some excellent graduate students and postdocs that I had the privilege to co-supervise with George. And also even in terms of organization, so those issues that I mentioned up to now, let's say it's very much research focused. But even in terms of organization, he did all this, and at the same time he was department chair, and I would say an excellent department chair. That I think made to me an extremely good impression, and that made me choose Philadelphia. And finally, my wife is from Pittsburgh, so that also fit very well into the plans.
So in moving to University of Pennsylvania, it looks like you started looking into problems of cross-fertilizations between the AI field and control, and I'm curious about how that unfolded.
Yes, I think that's interesting also for me to look back. I'm very happy in retrospect, especially in retrospect, with my choice. And the reason is, first of all, if I had stayed around ETH, it would have been difficult, but I could have stayed around ETH. I don't think I would have done anything new. Okay, I would have just continued working in similar areas. Coming to Pennsylvania, I was put into a totally different environment with different research objectives, and I had no choice, if you want, to start something new, to get engaged with students who would do similar things but still very different things from what I had done at ETH. And so this was enormously healthy for me. And one of the areas that started to emerge at this point, actually, when I came to Pennsylvania, was this machine learning and its interface with control, or also the other way around. How can you use some control theoretical principles to solve or address some machine learning problems? Now, in retrospect, now with several years, you can ask, was there a important cross-fertilization interface between machine learning and control, and in the other direction? And I would say we, and with that I mean the whole community, are still working on this. And the answer at this point has to be, it really depends on the application area. So, for example, if I go back to process control, the area I started with many years ago, we had something like machine learning. We had adaptive control, came around in the 1970s, great enthusiasm. But looking back, it was really not that successful. And the question now is, and one should reflect on why was the case so that we don't make the same mistakes that we made in the 1970s. And don't take me wrong, there was fantastic work done during that time, no question, but its impact on application, which ultimately decides on the survival of a method, was little. So why was this influence little? If you take the general area of control and all the problems that can be solved, then there's, on one hand, there's a group of easy problems. And easy problems means that, for example, the specs are very loose, the model is very well known, etc. So for those methods, it doesn't pay to use some advanced adaptive control scheme. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have problems that are impossible, that you couldn't solve by any automatic procedure or semi-automatic procedure. Maybe you could solve them with a lot of engineering effort, but nothing general emerges. And then in between those two extremes, you have the problems where you can consider the use advanced methods like the adaptive control of the 1970s, but this group in between may be very small. And so if you don't select some problem in this middle group, the adaptive control either failed or it required very much effort for giving you answers to very simple problems and where you wouldn't need the adaptive control scheme. So the second group of problems I think we worked at the time is that when you have large problems, large physical systems, large control systems, and that means large in the sense of many inputs and many outputs, as you do and have many process control problems. And again, for those problems, I don't think machine learning is a suitable method. What you should do there is use MPC, and MPC was very successful in this environment. And then the third group, which I obviously don't know much about, but at least looking at the robotics area, my impression is that the impact of machine learning has been enormous compared to what I saw being done in robotics when I started at ETH in the early 1990s. So in summary, I think we should reflect on this past experience when we engage in machine learning and control and pick from the beginning problems where there's more potential of having the impact than what we did in the 1970s. And I think the environment at Penn allowed me to do that.
Well, Manfred, this brings us to the end of the episode. It's been a real pleasure and honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you for listening. I hope you liked the show today. If you enjoyed the podcast, please consider giving us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, follow us on Spotify, support on Patreon or PayPal, and connect with us on social media platforms. See you next time.